Hey, hello.
Hi, how are you doing, Jimmy? I trust all is well.
All is well.
I'm glad to hear it.
Hi,
Uh,
Shane.
we- Hi, I hope you are well too. So it's been a little while, Jimmy, since we've talked.
A little
Uh,
bit, yeah.
I'm sure things are incredibly busy, both in Ericsson and everyday life. But I hope that you're taking some time to enjoy spring, which is looking pretty good here in Japan, at least.
Nice. No, we try. I've had the month off since we had our second kid being born just end of
Yes,
February. So I've been taking the
congratulations.
month off. So that's been great. Been enjoying
Congrats, all
some
the
of the early
best.
spring as well. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Have you had any chance to sleep in the last month?
Yeah, a little bit. But it's nice to be back at work and being able to relax again.
I'm really glad to hear that everything is going well, and awaiting baby pictures when the time is right.
I will not disappoint.
So before we get started properly, I'm going to just share my screen to share the antitrust notice with everyone. As usual, the full antitrust policy is on our website. And if you have any questions, you can ask me. If you're a Linux Foundation member, you can speak to our counsel, Andy Updegrove, as well. Now that that's out of the way, today is a little bit of a busy day. We have a few items to close off. Our survey for the whole planet is just about ready. There were some good comments came in there from Martin and Yari in the last few hours, I think. And that closes off and Marcel as well. That closes off our comments on that survey, and I'll share that in just 1 minute. We also are pretty much done with our reference security specification, which, just to remind you, is at that indeterminate phase where we have completed, I suppose you could say, remixing the useful parts of ISO 5230 and adding some additions for security. And we now have a document that can be utilized by people for a mental model. We're not yet at the stage where we say we want it to be a de facto standard. And that's really the next debate after we're happy with the reference document. We might want to make it a sister standard of 5230. We might want to make it an optional component of 5230. Those things are on the table. But before that, we have to get it out. And the release candidate is ready. So let's dive straight in. And I will start with the survey. So we've had a few last minute notes and comments on the survey. And they're not yet canonical. We are a few hours before we close off at the end of our week of editing on this. But the link I'm putting right into the chat takes you to the document that's live editing. And after we finish this conversation, I'm going to leave this document for 24 hours. And then we're moving wholly to GitHub for all future editing on the document through issues. So this is the last live edit. The document is not substantially changed, but there are a few notes. One of them, I haven't closed off the comments in the introductory section. I focused on the actual spec itself. We'll close those comments off later. Going into the actual spec, we've had some, where was it? There's some interesting changes on kind of the information we want to have. Oh wait, I'm on the wrong document, my apologies. I appear to have become more stupid than usual. Let's see if it shares properly. Survey, there we go. So the survey is closed off, but there are some additions. For instance, Marcel asked for an addition regarding revenue. He said it would be useful to have a question about revenue. I'm just going to share that document right now. And he thought it would be useful if, in sharing the information about revenue, it would contextualize the type of companies we've got in play. We are already asking about people, but the question about revenue is new. And, that's up for debate, but I think it fits. So the only item to really flag there, unless you seriously object, is, are those numbers right? Are those the numbers that feel good for you in Europe or in Taiwan and the United States? Just something to mull on. Annual revenue in the survey, is that correct? We can slice and dice it in a different way. I'll just explain why I sliced it this way. About 85% of the companies in Europe are small to medium enterprises. It's a different profile in, for instance, North America, where in many of the industries, it's very large entities. And it's a mixed profile in places like Japan, where we have huge conglomerates, but there's actually constellations of thousands of small companies. So I actually have more small numbers than big numbers. And this is because with all the love in the world, once you cross about $5 billion US, you're kind of one of those giant multinationals. And whether you're 5 billion or 500 billion, it doesn't make as much distinction perhaps as a company that's less than 1 million or a company that's 2 million. But that might be right. Hi.
Just go on, please.
Oh, that's it, basically. That's why I put those numbers.
Yes, you have 1 0 missing in the first number.
The first number?
Yes.
Oh, God. Very small revenue.
I think it's, I mean, the only thing that you could ask here is, does it really bring a value to know that in detail? Because in the end, the size is already giving you quite good indication. And I think for us, the most important part would be to get the people to complete as many as possible, and the less questions, the more likeliness that they complete. And that's why I would probably say, if you calculate, for example, in Europe, an average 200,000 euro per employee, you're mostly there, roundabout. So, but however, I mean, if we do not have too many questions, I would not bother too much about it.
And I got a note from Chris as well. He thinks it's, drifting out of scope of the information we need. So, we basically have 2 votes saying that we don't need to go down this avenue because the people numbers might be enough. Does anyone else have a note on that? What do you think? And I mean, Jan, I think you're right that we shouldn't have questions that we don't need. So, it's just a question, does anyone think it's needed? We have 1 vote in favor, basically, and 2 against. Okay, because we've got 2 against and only 1 in favor, it's out. Moving on, the other changes are relatively small. We have a change from saying, do you have a strategy, to do you have a documented strategy for open source, which of course moves into the idea of formalization of where you're going. I personally think that change is good because there's the entire possibility that the founder has the strategy in their head, but it contributes very little to the organizational strategy per se. So I think that's a good clarification. And certainly in jurisdictions such as Japan, the difference between having a general idea of your strategy versus a documented strategy is the difference between aspiration and actual execution.
Maybe one, Shane,
yeah.
To this, like, does your organization have a documented strategy? Should we add which is communicated to relevant people, or because if there's some documented strategy but it sits somebody's closet and nobody reads that, it's not useless either, or it's useless as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very important thing regarding the implementation, but I think it might be best if we put that type of granular thing in the second survey.
Yeah.
And once we pass this one, we go granular. Yeah, I mean, that's another point. For those of you who are new to it, this survey is intended to capture the market feel around open source and governance. We don't intend to stop here. but we want to get a good capture of the planet and take it from there. Jimmy asked, would it be sensible to ask if someone's a publicly traded company or not? That's an interesting point, actually.
My thinking is, of course, they tend to be of a certain size, or at least a certain size in terms of revenue, and probably a lower limit of how many employees they are. But it would be interesting to see if publicly traded companies, sort of as part of their due diligence or part of their general compliance work, have adopted this to a larger degree than non-publicly traded companies.
I think that has merit, and it's a very quick question. You know, if we put it, say here, you know, it's just yes or no, click, click, onward. I don't think that will be a hindrance, and it might be interesting because I believe in, of course, the United States, of course, in Japan, of course, in the European jurisdictions I'm familiar with, publicly traded companies have a higher burden of regulation than private companies. So if we had a correlation between that existence and their sophistication in open source, it could indicate where we'd need to put some new resources, and we'd say, okay, we know the publicly traded companies are coming here anyway. So we now have to focus on the non-traded companies to expand the standard. That's just me thinking out loud. What do you think?
Wouldn't hurt as a data point.
I'm adding that in. Or not. I'll finish that question later. We had a documented moment further down here, I think. Before that, a question: how many people in your OSPO? How many people are in your OSPO or assigned to open source? So this is after our question about whether you have an OSPO, whether you have, you know, people assigned, and if it's part-time or volunteer. So this would be a further question asking how many people are in play.
You might probably simplify the question a little bit, because in the end we want to know how much resource are dedicated to serve or to ensure compliance with this strategy. And probably when we rephrase this question a little bit, because I think it's an important indicator and can help a lot.
Yeah, and maybe there's something here. I just want to float it by you because some people like Jimmy or Chris are in sprawling organizations. My impression from the market is even the biggest organizations don't actually have that many people dedicated to open source per se. I mean, there are exceptions, but it's pretty much 10 or so people-ish, I find, in OSPOs across the world at most. Unless you're a granular organization where each of your group companies has an open source person or two. So Hitachi, for example, the group has 1,000 companies, and in the group, there's a lot of people assigned to open source across it. Though as my Hitachi contacts joke, that's also partially because none of them listen to each other in terms of the group.
Yeah, from my perspective, I'd say that whether or not you have an OSPO is going to drive that answer to that question, but how many people are in your open source, working open source is a different matter. If you're talking about the people that are doing the analysis of the software itself, either from a security standpoint or licensing.
I'm going to highlight that as something that really needs to be finessed if we're going to keep it.
Is that supposed to be an and, or is it an or?
Oh, that's an or.
Okay.
Because the immediate question before, and this is something that came out of the Japanese group, we have no OSPOs in many companies, but there are personnel told to deal with open source. And many of them are essentially volunteer. It's in addition to their regular work. And I mean, Chris, I think that's where I need to finesse the next question because it just isn't clear enough. We could say it's a placeholder that needs some clarification. This particular question comes out of the fact that there's a very substantial market where there's a high potential. We're looking at a lot of volunteers dealing with open source as opposed to OSPOs or fully assigned personnel. And I don't want to speak for Taiwan and so on, but SE, I'm guessing in the Taiwan market, there may be some parallels to this, where people have open source on top of their regular job to do.
And Shane, for me, as I don't know, we talked about here internally, that number of persons, etc. This is always relative. More interesting, at least from my side, would be what is the percentage of your whole software budget that you invest in open source? I don't know if that would match, but that for us that would be very interesting how to see in the industry, okay, or in other organizations, what is the share? If you, for example, have 100 developers, how many of them are concerned then with all those open source topics?
But wouldn't it then make sense to have a kind of, to ask for a sort of a ratio? So instead of having these questions, that we ask, for example, how many people do you have per 100 employees or per 100 developers or something like that?
Exactly, or real percentage of budget or whatever, if they use external companies, etc., etc. So
yeah,
I think it's going to be very difficult for you to get any useful information out of this. For example, I could argue that we have anywhere between 1 and 6 people in our virtual OSPO, if you like, but it's all volunteers and it's all less than 10% of their time. So in reality, it's less than 1 person. But it's difficult to put that in a way that's easy to quantify, that makes sense.
yeah, I also would not replace it. I would love to have it additionally, because for us, for the management, we never know what we shall tell our managers. Do we invest too much, too less, whatever? And to see that in total in other organizations, either all of us invest too less or too much, I don't know, but at least that you can have, because the overall budget everyone knows, right? And if you know, okay, and I invest nearly nothing to that, but even if I have a lot of software revenue, etc., so that this is some high, kind of mismatch, I would say, in any case.
Yeah, if you put it as FTE, it probably makes more sense, especially if there's a question as to how many people are using open source further on, because then you can divide one by the other, if you like, without asking extra questions.
sounds good. Yeah.
Yeah, because like, for example, we don't have an OSDO, but we do have a software development, which is our software developers are, let's just say, more than 1,000. And in the last 5 years, the percentage of them who are actually using some open source in their software development has gone up by 100%.
This is a really good point. And let's roll with the FTE and see what we get. And from this data, we look at the secondary survey to provide the next point, unpacking it.
Shane, maybe yet another point, sorry for this, but there was the question about how many people there are in a company.
Yeah.
Should there be also like how many software developers there are in a company?
I mean, I agree. It's a very useful question. I'm just worried we're going to end up with too many questions.
Yeah. But then, it would be easy, let's say, if we get the number of FTEs who are dedicated to open source, just to make, the ratio.
What would you guys think about us asking the question, sort of, how big is your organization? How many people are dedicated to software in the organization? Or, should we just double it up and have both questions?
Probably that's a good idea, because in the end, there are many, many large companies that we know, but they have probably 10 people sitting there doing some software development. And so they would run into the 5,000 section, but only selling one steering device development thing.
Both questions is fine, I think. Makes sense.
And again, I think one of the things with this questionnaire, will be that we won't make it so that you can't skip stuff. I think what we want is people to answer the questionnaire, even if they leave out a few questions. And I'm just putting that up because in the past, we have found surveys around our ecosystem to get a lot more response if people can leave chunks out, which leads us to, of course, uneven data, but it does lead to larger data capture. Are you comfortable with that? I'm just thinking it's a mechanism so they can skim through and hit the stuff they care about.
I'm fine with that.
Do you mean as an alternative approach to not applicable or not sure?
Well, that's why not applicable is everywhere. So the idea is that we're actively encouraging people to skip as if they feel like it.
Yeah, I think I'm good with the idea of having not applicable or not sure, because I'm guessing that in a lot of cases the person answering the survey won't know, and they're not going to go to the effort of trying to find out for their organization. So to be able to do that, I think is fine, but I think it's probably better to have them click not applicable and move on rather than not completely, completely ignore the question. But
Okay, sounds good. We're already structured for that. Moving down, we're back at documented. So, do you have an open source policy? Was there before, and it's been changed to do you have a documented open source policy, and determining whether that documented policy is organization or department level. And I think that's a good change. I think that's probably the correct data point approach we needed.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, Shane, what is the reason for having it department level rather than any other level? And for people who don't call them departments or whatever, it seems a bit strange.
So I think perhaps it may be primarily in Asia, but a lot of the companies in Japan and China and Korea refer to different sections as departments. And for example, in Samsung Electronics, there's going to be the television department and there's going to be the cell phone department. And they can be operating in parallel, but completely separately to each other. And there could also be in electronics, a white goods department, which has nothing to do with smart devices. So they don't have an open source policy, just as an example.
Well, I guess that's why I'm asking. That's kind of meaningless then, isn't it? So it's either a complete organization policy or a subset, and that's it, basically. That subset could be any amount of people. Because we don't know what they mean by the person who's answering. We have no idea what they think is a department level, so we have no way of quantifying what that answer actually means.
Yep.
To my mind, it just means that it's not for the entire organization. It's for some subset. Not sure how to capture that, but at department level, I don't think I'd know what to answer.
I'm just putting subset there for now. If anyone has a better phrase, that's good. If not, I'll go back and rephrase it a little later.
Okay, sounds good.
All righty, good point. Good point. Good point. I think that's it.
It's very specific to Samsung. It is called division.
Yeah, that's the problem. Different people have different names for it, so they won't know what it means. And if the division has a department, you'll get something else. So
it's valid point.
Yeah, it's useful. Yep. Okay, that's the entire survey. We're basically good to go. I've got a few tweaks to do, but then we're ready. I just add the public or not question, and we fill it. I tidy up the software question, and I do the subset thing, and we're good to go. If you have any last minute things you want in, the link is copied. Just so you know, the survey is already translated. I just put the link back in the chat once again, so you don't have to scroll. This survey is already translated into Chinese and Japanese, and they're ready to adjust it. The translation into Chinese at the moment is simplified Chinese. It's been done by Tencent, and I think CESI is having a quick review of it as well. So we'll be ready to go later this week. I'm thinking of launching the survey on Wednesday, the 30th of March. And I'm thinking we keep the survey open for 1 month and we push it through our channels as much as possible and try to get a really good feel for where the market's at.
Sure.
Okay. Now, the next item is not really an open editing item. It's our security document, which is now pretty much ready for release candidate. I'm going to put the link of that into our chat. I just take a second here, and here we go. So for background, in case you weren't around, the security document, the reference spec has been built over the last mostly 2 months to 3 months. It's based on the reference guide we built for August last year. SC has just volunteered to translate the survey to traditional Chinese. Perfect. Yes, you are completely now officially volunteered and there's no escape. So this particular security document is now pretty much done. We have a few notes in the introduction and around, I believe, yeah, around requirements and stuff. There's a few notes to close off. So we have a handful of things to close off, but I believe that once these comments are closed, and essentially the closing is that we're going to accept the comments and we're going to clarify according to the comments. We're ready to go release candidate. So my aim is to close those comments and go release candidate again for the 30th of March. And I just wanted to give those 2 days for people to have one more look at it if they want, to help us either close those comments or to help us catch something we've missed. Once we go release candidate, this will be open to the community to have a noodle on, and I'm going to give them a 2-week initial period until our next bi-weekly call and a little bit more. And I'm going to ask them to provide their feedback so that we can determine if the release candidate needs any substantial adjustment or not. That feedback will not be on this Word document. That feedback will be captured on GitHub. So after this call, this document is moving to GitHub, and it will be edited only with issues submitted there. So in other words, the people on this call are the last people to have full access to this document, to mess around with it. The document is ideally positioned for you to leave comments, so I can actually edit the document. That makes it simpler if we want to go into the ISO process or similar, because we only want to have a very limited subset of actual authors on the document. In 24 hours, this document closes, everything moves to GitHub. And we release on March 30th. I'm not expecting input right now because this is one of those things you have to read and it takes a while, but I'm just flagging that's where we are. You can edit this Word document for 24 hours if you wish. I'm going to be closing off the comments from Yari in the next 24 hours. And then this goes on GitHub and it's announced to the community as a release candidate. The way we frame it is that this is a reference specification, and now it's the community's time to examine it, decide if it's got any issues, and then to start discussing about what we do with it next. Do we release it as a sister standard, as a de facto standard? Do we add it as an optional standard to 5230? What do we do? And that'll be an open discussion on our main mailing list to ensure everyone has a voice. Okie dokie, 24 hours on the document, 24 hours. Yep, Chris.
Just a quick question. I noticed that a lot of the comments are kind of grayed out, and some of them are in regular bold font.
Yep.
What's the difference?
Mostly the comments that are fully grayed out should be the ones that have been asked and addressed. And the ones that are still active or showing up clearly should be the ones we have to close.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome. And Chris, you raised a very important point. yeah, you might see different comments depending on how you've got your viewing on. So my viewing is only showing active comments unclosed, but some people see all the comments on a document. Grayed off comments are comments we've clicked resolve on. And that they might even be unanswered, but they've been resolved for one reason or another. And the ones that are bold or showing are the ones that are unresolved. And there should only be, I think Yari came through with a few of them, and I made a note or two. So there's only like 8 or 6 or 7 unresolved comments. So it's a pretty small subset.
Dane, I can remember that that we've had a discussion that we were not able to finish in the last meeting when we were discussing about this standard. And I remember that it was something about, it had to do with some sort of structure, and I thought it was quite relevant, but I am absolutely incapable of remembering what it was about. We wanted to transition this to email, but nothing happened there as far as I recognize.
Yes, so when we had some email about the document, no one engaged, so nothing happened there. But yeah, there was a discussion about potentially restructuring the document, and I will bring that explicitly forward once again. At the same time, I think that restructuring the document is probably something very valid to explore. But I mean, I'm going to do a quick test here. Who on the call recalls exactly what that restructuring was meant to be off the top of your head? And if you don't, I think it might be something we can leave for version 2.
But no, I wasn't about restructuring as far as I remember. It was a little bit about the way the communication inside the company should be organized that we are requiring. So, but I can't remember who was actually making these comments. And but I remember there was a very interesting part.
I'm going to go back over our recording and pick that up again so that we can swing back to it. Yeah. So what I'll do, I'm going to keep it on the timeline that we closed this document in 24 hours. So this document has been our document, the call document, and it gets closed and it's released to the community via GitHub. So as it's released to the community via GitHub, I'm going to come back to the recording about that potential addition and use that as one of the triggering questions for conversation with the community on the 30th of March. Brilliant. All righty, that's it. The survey is pretty much done. The security release candidate is pretty much done. The survey closes now. Basically, it's finished and it'll go out on the 30th, but it's closed for the 29th onwards. This document will close in 24 hours on the 29th of March. And it will also be released on the 30th. All I can say is, first of all, thank you everyone for incredible contributions on this material. It's important. The security standard coming out in this quarter is a milestone that I think puts us well ahead of the curve of where the market is at. Most people are still trying to work out what to do. We've been talking about it for months, and now we have a release candidate product to market, which is great. And the survey, obviously, if we can push it through our channels, the information we get here might be the first truly high-level global picture of open source governance. We've had a lot of things like OSPOs with To-Do Group. We've had software bill of materials, but we're doing the usual OpenChain snapshot. And I think that could be a very, very useful thing to build on. And to Yari's point earlier, once we have the initial data set, we start drilling down and we can start building other surveys and push them through our work groups just as hard in the next quarters. Okay, and now something very exciting, which is where we actually switch off English. This work group meeting now transitions to a webinar meeting, and it's purposefully placed here because it's a transition point for our community. Yeah, Chris, there's plenty time for circulation, just a message came in. There's 24 hours on the actual document for main editing, but even after 24 hours, this document can be edited. The release candidate will be framed as something for the community to spend 30 days going over. So the only difference between what we're doing now and the release candidate is that our free form editing on phone calls is done, and it'll move to GitHub issues and email only. Yeah, so we're going to do a little webinar now, which I don't expect non-Korean speakers and non-Japanese speakers and non-Chinese speakers to actually stay for. But we have this webinar in Korean with subtitles in Chinese and Japanese. And the reason we're doing it as a webinar here is because it's a little bit of a change for the community. And therefore, I wanted to put it in a place that allows it to be an official webinar, but also acknowledges the fact that it's going to take a while for messaging to go out through the community that not all webinars will be English in the future. We will have more webinars in more languages because we have a large addressable market in places like, let's say, China, 1.3 billion people, and we want to increase our capture of mindshare. In the future, I do hope we'll have webinars in, for instance, Japanese and Korean and Chinese, which have English subtitles. But I don't have that today. So you're getting a Korean webinar being recorded, and it'll be released as a webinar on our official channel later. And the purpose of this is an inflection point where, again, we are becoming increasingly international. We're looking at getting deeper in the supply chain. And that means thinking a little bit differently than most open source projects and approaches. Okie dokie. That's going to start sharing. And that is going to be far more coherent than I am. Let's see if I can actually get it shared as a video. Right. This is a video from Kyungye Kim, who is with LG Electronics. She is the head of the open source department there, and one of the more experienced people in our field. So you can expect her to have a lot to say on the topics we're covering. And you can expect her to also be very clear and cognizant of what she's talking about. She's talking about Foslight, which is an internal tool that LG Electronics used for many years. And now they've released as open source for everyone else to use. In places like Germany, there's a lot of traction for SW360, Fossology, ORT, and so on. But it's different over in Asia, and the market is less coalesced. So having something like a Korean code released with the Korean language support, and now Japanese and Chinese support, is another important inflection point in getting open source tooling out there for open source compliance. And here we go with the overview of what she's up to. I trust the video is showing all right.
안녕하세요. 오늘 발표를 맡은 LG전자의 김경희 책임입니다. 오늘 저는 포스라이트로 완성하는 오픈소스 거버넌스에 대해서 소개해드리려고 합니다. 먼저 오픈소스 거버넌스를 LG전자 기준에서 설명해 드리겠습니다. LG전자는 오픈소스 프로그램 오피스라는 이름으로 컴플라이언스, 그리고 컨트리뷰션, 그리고 오픈소스 컬처의 역할을 담당하고 있는데요. 컴플라이언스를 만족하기 위해서 진행해야 되는 여러 프로세스, 툴, 컨설팅 등에 대해서 소개를 드리고, 그것에 필요한 포스라이트라는 툴에 대해서 저희가 올해 오픈소스 프로젝트로 공개한 포스라이트라는 툴에 대해서 소개를 드리려고 합니다. LG전자 오픈소스 프로그램 오피스가 궁금하시면 oss.lg.com으로 접속해서 보시면 LG전자의 오픈소스 프로그램과 그리고 LG전자에서 공개하고 있는 오픈소스 프로젝트, 그리고 LG전자에서 공개하고 있는 오픈소스 가이드에 대해서 확인하실 수가 있습니다. LG전자의 오픈소스 컴플라이언스는 크게 5개의 축으로 구성되어 있습니다. 각각에 대해서는 다음 슬라이드에서 설명드리도록 하겠습니다. 먼저 LG전자의 오픈소스 조직은 오픈소스 프로그램 오피스, 전 조직을 컴플라이언스와 기여, 여러 가지를 모두 감당하는 오픈소스 프로그램 오피스가 있고요. 각 사업부별로 오픈소스 컴플라이언스 역할을 또 담당하는 각각의 담당 부서가 있고, 각각의 사업부의 오픈소스 담당 부서는 각각의 소프트웨어 개발팀과 협력하여 오픈소스 거버넌스를 구축하고 있습니다. LG전자의 오픈소스 정책은 다음과 같습니다. 첫 번째, 오픈소스를 사용할 때 지켜야 할 정책, 그리고 서드파티에서 오픈소스 소프트웨어를 가져왔을 때의 정책, 이게 서플라이 체인 관리에 중점이 되는 정책입니다. 그리고 오픈소스를 기여할 때의 정책과 오픈소스 외부에서 클레임이 들어왔을 때의 정책이 각각 있습니다. 그래서 각각의 정책에 따라 프로세스를 구성하고 있는데요. LG전자 오픈소스 컴플라이언스는 크게 4단계로 이루어졌습니다. 오픈소스를 무엇을 사용했는지 확인하는 단계, 그리고 오픈소스를 승인하는 단계, 그리고 최종적으로 사용한 오픈소스에 대해서 고지하고, 그리고 사용한 오픈소스에 대해서 공개하고, 그리고 그걸 배포하는 4단계로 이루어져 있는데요. 이 각각의 별표 친 부분에 대해서 저희는 툴을 이용하고 있고, 그 툴을 포스라이트라는 이름으로 오픈소스로 공개했습니다. 또 이와 별개로 LG전자 사내에서 교육을 진행하고 있는데요. 교육은 온라인 콘텐츠로 오픈소스 라이센스나 오픈소스 컴플라이언스에 대해서 알 수 있는 온라인 콘텐츠와 그리고 각각의 툴의 사용법에 대해서 알 수 있는 비디오 콘텐츠로 이루어져 있고요. 그리고 분기별로 각각의 오픈소스 담당자들이 모여서 워크숍을 진행하고 있습니다. 이 워크숍에서는 각 오픈소스 소송이라던가 최근 동향, 그리고 LG전자 정책, 개선된 프로세스, 그리고 각 사업부에서의 베스트 프랙티스를 공유하는 여러 아젠다들로 구성하고 있습니다. LG전자의 오픈소스 툴은 포스라이트라는 이름으로 공개되어 있는데요. 먼저 개발자가 소프트웨어를 개발할 때 오픈소스를 분석합니다. 그때 디펜던시 분석, 소스 분석, 그리고 바이너리 분석, 각각의 오픈소스 분석을 포스라이트 스캐너를 이용해서 분석을 하고 있고요. 그 분석한 결과 오픈소스 BOM, 즉 오픈소스 리스트가 나오게 됩니다. 그 오픈소스 리스트를 포스라이트 허브라는 시스템에서 오픈소스와 라이센스를 관리하고 컴플라이언스 프로세스 전체를 관리하고 그리고 보안 취약점까지 발견해주는 포스라이트 허브라는 시스템을 통해서 한 곳에서 모든 것을 관리하고 있습니다. 그 이후에 오픈소스 고지문이 나오게 되면 저희는 이거를 오픈소스 배포 사이트 opensource.lg.com을 통해서 고객에게 공개하고 있습니다. 이번 4월에 오픈소스 프로젝트로 공개한 포스라이트에 대해서 소개를 드릴 건데요. 포스라이트 프로젝트는 크게 2가지로 구성이 되어 있습니다. 하나는 스캐너이고요. 하나는 뒤에서 말씀드릴 허브인데요. 스캐너는 디펜던시 분석, 그리고 소스 분석, 그리고 바이너리 분석을 주로 하는 각각의 오픈소스 스캐너로 구성되어 있습니다. 세 스캐너는 모두 오픈소스 프로젝트로 공개되어 있고요. 각 플랫폼 스페시픽한 안드로이드와 욕토를 분석하는 오픈소스 스캐너는 아직 공개되어 있지는 않고 디펜던시, 소스코드, 바이너리에 대해서만 포스라이트 스캐너라는 이름으로 공개가 되어 있습니다. 포스라이트 허브는 포스라이트 스캐너에서 만들어진 오픈소스 결과를 가지고 여러 올인원 서비스로 모든 것을 관리해주고 있는데요. 첫 번째는 라이센스 관리를 할 수 있고요. 두 번째로는 오픈소스 관리도 할 수가 있습니다. 그리고 세 번째로 오픈소스의 보안 취약점을 관리하고 그리고 컴플라이언스 프로세스 전체를 한 곳에서 관리할 수 있게 해줍니다. 그리고 서플라이 체인 매니지먼트도 가능한데요. 서드파티에서 가져온 오픈소스 리스트를 관리하고 그 오픈소스의 이슈 트래킹하고 또 그 오픈소스의 보안 취약점이 발견되고 있는지까지도 모두 관리할 수가 있습니다. 마지막으로 BOM 관리도 가능한데요. 오픈소스 BOM을 관리해서 어떤 오픈소스가 어느 프로젝트에서 사용되고 있는지, 어느 서드파티 리스트에서 사용되고 있는지도 확인하실 수가 있습니다. 포스라이트 허브 덕분에 저희는 오픈체인 ISO 5230 인증을 2019년에 받았습니다. 2019년에 오픈체인 인증을 받고 그리고 올해 ISO 5230 등록된 이후에 오픈체인 2.1로 다시 어나운스먼트를 했는데요. 저희는 LG전자가 오픈체인 인증을 받게 된 덕분이 포스라이트 덕분이라고 생각하고 있습니다. 그래서 LG전자에서 이 오픈체인 스펙을 만족하기 위해서 포스라이트라는 툴을 이용해서 각각의 이 항목들을 모두 만족시킬 수 있었던 것 같습니다. 포스라이트 허브에 대해서 좀 더 자세히 설명을 드려보도록 하겠습니다. 포스라이트 허브는 앞에서 설명드린 것과 같이 오픈소스 관리가 가능합니다. 각각의 오픈소스에 대해서 오픈소스 다운로드 로케이션은 어디인지, 웹사이트는 어디인지, 그리고 그 오픈소스에 보안 취약점이 있는지 없는지, 그리고 오픈소스의 라이센스를 각각 버전별로 관리를 하고 있기 때문에 버전에 따라 다른 오픈소스 라이센스를 갖는 경우도 확인할 수가 있고요. 또 어떤 오픈소스는 GPL이나 MIT, 듀얼 라이센스로 배포되고 있기도 한데 이런 듀얼 라이센스의 개념 그리고 한 오픈소스 프로젝트가 GPL and LGPL로 배포될 수도 있는데 그런 멀티 라이센스의 개념도 모두 표현할 수 있게 되어 있습니다. 그래서 오픈소스 관리를 이렇게 한 시스템에서 모두 관리하고 있고요. 라이센스 관리도 가능합니다. 라이센스가 BSD 라이센스인지 그리고 각각의 의무사항이 무엇인지 이런 것들도 모두 관리를 할 수가 있고요. 라이센스 관리의 가장 큰 좋은 점 중에 하나가 똑같은 BSD3 라이센스라고 해도 각각 개발자들이 칭하는 명칭이 조금씩 다를 수가 있는데요. 어떤 사람은 UBSD 라이센스라고 말하기도 하고 어떤 사람은 BSD3, 어떤 사람은 BSD3 클로즈 라이센스 이렇게 다양한 오픈소스 라이센스 이름으로 명칭할 수가 있는데 저희는 여기에 닉네임이란 기능을 이용해서 어떤 라이센스 이름으로 입력하더라도 이것이 BSD3라고 하나의 라이센스로 인지할 수 있게 해주고 있습니다. 그리고 라이센스의 의무사항 관리도 해주는데요. 소스 공개 혹은 고지의 의무, 주요 기능 말고도 리스트릭션이라는 칼럼을 이용해서 여러 가지 다른 제약사항, 예를 들면 non-commercial, 상업적으로 사용할 수 없는 건지 이런 것들도 모두 체크할 수가 있고요. 리스트릭션은 사용자에 따라서 얼마든지 추가가 가능합니다. 보안 취약점도 저희가 관리를 해주고 있는데요. 보안 취약점이 최근 오픈소스 관리의 가장 큰 중요한 점으로 떠오르고 있잖아요. 그래서 저희는 오픈소스 이름으로 보안 취약점을 검색할 수 있는 기능이 포함되어 있는데 예를 들어 오픈SSL로 검색하면 이렇게 많은 보안 취약점들이 나오는 걸 확인하실 수가 있습니다. 각각의 오픈SSL 버전에 따라서 저기 빨간색과 검은색으로 표시되어 있는 게 보안 취약점의 등급에 따른 분류인데요. 각각을 클릭하면 MVD의 CVE로 링크가 연결되면서 보안 취약점의 자세한 내용도 확인하실 수가 있습니다. 보안 취약점이란 건 처음부터 존재하는 게 아니라 어느 날 갑자기 생기기도 하는데요. 업데이트돼서. 그러면 이미 만들어진 프로젝트에서 처음 보안 취약점을 확인했다 하더라도 나중에 다시 보안 취약점을 확인하기가 어려움이 있습니다. 그래서 저희는 이미 생성한 프로젝트에서 새로운 보안 취약점이 발견됐을 때 메일로 이렇게 알려주는 알림 기능이 있습니다. 그래서 새로 발견된 오픈소스에 대해서 저렇게 메일로 보안 취약점 링크와 보안 취약점 점수를 알려줌으로써 개발팀에서 새로 발견된 보안 취약점을 확인하고 거기에 대해서 대응할 수 있도록 시스템이 구성되어 있습니다. 그리고 포스라이트 허브의 가장 중요한 기능 중에 하나는 컴플라이언스 프로세스 관리가 가능하다는 점입니다. 아까 제가 보여드렸던 LG전자의 오픈소스 컴플라이언스 프로세스 4단계에 맞춰서 아이덴티피케이션, 패키징, 그리고 디스트리뷰션, 어프루블은 저희가 아이덴티피케이션을 끝나고 리뷰할 때 어프루블 단계가 진행이 되는 거고요. 그래서 아이덴티피케이션, 어프루블, 패키징, 디스트리뷰션 이 4단계의 역할을 이 포스라이트 허브에서 모두 관리를 하고 있습니다. 이렇게 관리를 하면서 얻을 수 있는 장점은 각 프로젝트의 보안 취약점도 이렇게 한눈에 볼 수가 있고요. 각각의 프로젝트가 어느 단계까지 진행하고 있는지 또 한눈에 보실 수가 있고 여기에서는 오픈소스 이름이나 그 프로젝트에서 사용하고 있는 오픈소스 라이센스라던가 1년에 몇 건의 프로젝트가 진행되고 있는지 이런 정보들을 검색할 수 있고 또 이 기능은 통계 기능을 이용해서 별도의 대시보드로도 확인이 가능합니다. 서플라이 체인 매니지먼트는 최근에 중요해지고 있는 개념인데요. 왜냐하면 최근에 BOM 관리도 중요해지기 때문인데 서드파티에서 가져온 프로젝트 혹은 서드파티에서 가져온 소프트웨어에 어떤 오픈소스가 포함되어 있는지 어떠한 소프트웨어가 포함되었는지 확인하고 그걸 관리하는 게 중요하기 때문입니다. 그래서 저희는 서드파티도 이렇게 리스트로 관리를 하고 있는데요. 각각의 서드파티 리스트에 대해서 저희는 이런 정보들을 취합해서 저장하고 있습니다. 서드파티와 맺은 계약서라던가 서드파티에서 받은 오픈소스 리스트 이런 정보들을 가지고 그리고 각각의 서드파티 리스트에서 받은 오픈소스 리스트를 등록해서 리뷰하고 그 받은 리스트에 보안 취약점이 있는지 없는지 혹은 라이센스를 사용할 수 있는지 없는지 이런 것들을 확인해서 서드파티 소프트웨어를 리뷰하는데 이 포스라이트 허브라는 시스템을 이용하고 있습니다. BOM 관리는 서드파티뿐만 아니라 자체적으로 관리하고 있는 프로젝트에서도 중요한데요. 최근에 미국에서 SBOM의 중요성에 대해서 대두되고 있습니다. SBOM이란 것은 소프트웨어 빌 오브 머터리얼, 즉 소프트웨어의 목록인데요. 저희는 이거를 BOM 관리를 따로 이렇게 하고 있습니다. 각 프로젝트별로 이 소프트웨어 BOM, 꼭 오픈소스 BOM만 관리하는 건 아니고 저희는 지금은 오픈소스 BOM을 주력해서 관리하고 있는데 서드파티나 혹은 프로퍼레이티 소프트웨어도 함께 관리는 가능하고 있습니다. 라이센스를 별도로 추가하고 여기 리스트에 넣으면 되거든요. 그래서 소프트웨어 BOM을 이렇게 프로젝트별로 관리도 가능하고요. 그리고 예를 들어 카이로라는 오픈소스를 사용한 프로젝트들이 있는지 확인하고 싶을 때 이런 BOM 관리를 저희가 하고 있기 때문에 카이로를 입력하고 검색을 하면 카이로를 사용한 오픈소스, 카이로라는 오픈소스를 사용한 프로젝트 리스트를 한 번에 알 수 있습니다. 즉 BOM 관리를 체계적으로 하고 있기 때문에 어떤 오픈소스를 사용하고 있는 프로젝트를 확인하고 싶다던가 어떤 라이센스를 사용하고 있는 프로젝트를 알고 싶을 때 이렇게 프로젝트 리스트에 BOM 관리를 할 수 있는 것이죠. 그리고 마지막으로 저희는 이슈 트래킹도 포스라이트 허브를 통해서 하고 있는데요. 포스라이트 허브에서는 커멘트 기능이 있어서 오픈소스를 리뷰하고 라이센스를 리뷰할 때 서로 사용자 개발팀과 그리고 이 리뷰를 진행하는 오픈소스 프로그램 오피스, 저희가 서로 커뮤니케이션을 하고 있습니다. 그래서 여기 안에 있는 커멘트들을 통해서 어떤 이슈들이 있었는지를 트래킹하고 나중에 확인하고 싶을 때 히스토리 파악을 하는데 굉장히 유용합니다. 마지막으로 포스라이트는 여러 웹사이트를 통해서 여러 커뮤니케이션 채널을 통해서 소통하고 있습니다. 포스라이트.org에 들어와서 보시면 저희 포스라이트에 대한 소개, 그리고 포스라이트 스캐너에 대한 소개, 포스라이트 허브에 대한 소개, 그리고 쉽게 따라갈 수 있는 가이드 페이지를 제공하고 있고요. 그리고 여러분들이 직접 포스라이트를 설치하지 않고도 포스라이트를 체험해 볼 수 있도록 데모 사이트를 운영하고 있습니다. demo.postwrite.org에 들어오셔서 얼마든지 직접 체험해 보실 수가 있고요. 또 포스라이트 사용법에 대한 가이드 외에도 포스라이트를 설치해서 사용하는 가이드도 제공하고 있으니 언제든지 오셔서 직접 설치해서 사용해 보실 수도 있습니다. 또 포스라이트 슬랙.com을 통해서 슬랙 채널을 운영하고 있는데요. 포스라이트를 사용하면서 궁금한 사항들, 어려운 점, 이런 것들을 슬랙을 통해서 쉽게 문의하실 수가 있습니다. 현재는 포스라이트 가이드와 포스라이트 소개 페이지가 국문과 영문으로만 제공이 되고 있습니다. 혹시 일본어나 중국어로 번역을 해주신다면 저희 사이트에 연동을 해서 훨씬 많은 사용자들이 포스라이트를 이용해 보실 수 있을 것 같습니다. 마지막으로 저희가 보여드릴 것은 저희가 운영하고 있는 오픈소스 프로그램 오피스의 유튜브 채널입니다. 저희는 유튜브 채널을 통해서 포스라이트를 사용하는 방법, 포스라이트를 설치하는 방법, 그리고 포스라이트 스캐너 외에도 저희가 공개하고 있는 포스라이트 리유즈라는 툴도 사용법에 대해서 소개하고 있고요. 유튜브 채널은 주기적으로 계속 업데이트 되고 있으니 필요하시면 구독을 눌러주시면 업데이트된 내용들을 확인해 보실 수가 있습니다. 포스라이트는 여러 채널에도 소개가 됐는데요. 일본 기사에도 소개된 적이 있고 중국 기사에도 소개된 적이 있습니다. 그래서 오늘 발표를 들으시는 여러 일본과 중국에 계신 분들도 포스라이트를 한번 사용해 보시고 그리고 저희가 바라는 건 기여인데요. 특히나 바라고 있는 기여는 포스라이트 사이트가 현재 국문과 영문으로만 메뉴를 제공하고 있습니다. 그래서 만약에 저희가 이 국문하고 영문만 선택할 수가 있게 되어 있는데 저희 포스라이트 깃허브에 메시지를 번역해서 기여를 해주신다면 바로 일본어와 중국어의 기능이 추가될 수 있기 때문에 중국과 일본에 계신 여러분들이 포스라이트를 훨씬 더 쉽게 사용하실 수가 있을 것 같습니다. 그래서 이번 발표를 통해서 중국어와 일본어 언어 기여가 들어오기를 간절히 바라고 있습니다. 오늘 제가 포스라이트에 대해서 소개를 드렸는데요. LG전자의 오픈소스 거버넌스는 포스라이트를 통해서 완성되었다고 해도 과언이 아닙니다. 그래서 여러분들도 포스라이트를 통해서 각 기업의 오픈소스 거버넌스를 완성시킬 수 있는 기회가 되길 바라겠습니다. 들어주셔서 감사합니다.
Alrighty. And there we have Kyung-Ye talking about Fastlight. We will be doing more to explain Fastlight in the English language and hopefully other languages in time. And I want to go in the other direction and try to make sure that, for instance, tools like Open Source Review Toolkit are communicated in Japanese, Korean, Chinese moving forward. You can expect our webinar schedule to begin to reflect this in Q2. Thank you for your time, your patience, your attention, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next week at our next webinar and in 2 weeks at our next Global Work Team meeting. To recap, the survey is pretty much done. It will be locked shortly after this call, and it will be released on the 30th of March. We expect to have translations in Japanese. We expect to have simplified Chinese, and perhaps shortly after that, we will have traditional Chinese and hopefully German, French, and so on. Okay, and then we have our security reference standard, which is basically done. There's 24 hours to make any final comments on the current document, and then we close that, move it to GitHub as a release candidate, and we open the discussion to the global community on our mailing list, bringing in one of the points from our meeting 2 weeks ago. Thank you for your time, attention, be well, be safe.